This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 22 and 23 in Seminar 3. Lectures 22 and 23 are unlike anything I've covered so far in this series. They are some of the most obscure text I've encountered in Lacan, which is saying quite a bit. And yet, in slowly working through these lectures, I discovered that they offer some of the most important insights into what Lacan is getting at in this entire Seminar 3. We could say that these lectures function as a kind of quilting point for the entire seminar. But like the quilting point, they are highly enigmatic and elusive. Presenting an analysis of these lectures is no less challenging than understanding them. And I've vacillated between emphasizing depth versus emphasizing a more broad thematic presentation of what seems to me to be most central. And since I couldn't decide, I'm having to split the difference. And so there will be a two-part video series. In part one, which is this video, I'll be attempting to explain what's going on here in these lectures without getting too much into the details in terms of the linguistic analyses Lacan is performing. It will be more of an overview and explanation of what Lacan is trying to do with these analyses, and less so a consideration of their specific content. The second video, in contrast, which should come out later this coming week, will provide a more in-depth analysis, but with the warning that it probably will be best to have attempted to struggle through these lectures rather than listening to me first. So okay, let's see how this goes. To understand why Lacan is taking on these very detailed and complex analyses of sentences, I think it's important to keep in mind his overall project, which I'm breaking down here into 12 points. 1. He is trying to get us to understand the nature of psychosis and how it's different from neurosis, a difference that is fundamental to psychoanalytic thinking. 2. The way he conceptualizes this difference is not in terms of clinical symptoms, but in terms of clinical structures. Symptoms may be a surface-level expression of these structures, but they're not what allows us to understand those structures. 3. A clinical structure is, for the most part, equivalent to the unconscious itself. The notion of a structure is modeled after language, which is why Lacan says, famously, the unconscious is structured like a language. 4. Language is a system of communication that is composed of basic differentiated elements called signifiers. In contrast to the originator of structural linguistics, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Lacan conceives of language in terms of these signifiers rather than readily conjoining signifiers with their meanings, the signifieds, that together would form signs. For Lacan, the relation between signifiers and signifieds is a very tenuous one at best. 5. The unconscious, which is a structure, consists of a specific constellation of signifiers that's intimately linked to the larger symbolic order. Signifieds, on the other hand, entail an imaginary dimension of language. These two dimensions of language, symbolic and imaginary, have previously been represented using schema L. 6. As stated, language is a system of communication, and as such, we must not think of the unconscious as like a solitary storage facility for signifiers just waiting to be deployed. The unconscious, in being structured like a language, is a manner of communication that takes place through the exchange and movement of these signifiers. 7. These exchanges of signifiers are governed by rules. These rules are specific to the social, cultural context that is situated within its own symbolic order. The rules dictate what moves are permitted and which are prohibited, what signifiers are allowed to enter into explicit discourse and which are not. Those signifiers that are prohibited and thus not allowed to enter into explicit discourse form what is called the unconscious subject. The fundamental signifier that represents these rules of prohibition and permission to the subject is the big other. It is another subject who represents the rules of the symbolic to the subject. In representing the rules or law to the subject, the big other communicates itself through commandments. Thou art this, thou shalt not. These commandments for Lacan are necessary as they call one into an identity that delivers a basic sense of oneself and makes one's reality something that can be readily navigated. They position the subject in a certain relationship to the big other. And this positioning orients me to my world and especially to the others, the little others, with whom I'm in relationship at an imaginary level. 9. We should not think of these commandments, the speech of the big other, as something ordinarily literal, that is, something audible. Instead, it is, for most of us, what might be best correlated with the voice of our own conscience. And for the most part, I'm not aware of it. Instead of being aware of signifiers themselves and their exchanges, I'm mostly preoccupied with signifieds, with meanings that I give things, and especially the meanings and associated affects, emotions pertaining to my relationships with others, the little others. These meanings are often in the mode of comparisons and contrast between myself and these others, who to varying degrees I identify with, and for this reason can evoke strong emotions of love and hate. 10. While this discourse with little others is happening at the level of the imaginary, the discourse between unconscious subject and big other continues on. The unconscious subject, despite being repressed, desires recognition, desires to enter into the light of day and be integrated into explicit discourse. It expresses this insistence in the form of a doubt, which in turn gets represented as a question. The big other says, "Thou art that," and the subject replies, "Am I? What is it to be that?" Now, the ego refuses to recognize such a question coming from the unconscious subject because it's too threatening to the established equilibrium that the ego has come to identify itself with. And as such, the question, which itself is a signifier, gets reformulated into a symptom. 11. This takes us to Seminar 3, where the overarching question is this: what happens when the signifier that represents the big other doesn't properly take hold of the subject? In this seminar, we've learned that the signifier is really important because it's what structures and then binds the signified meanings at the level of the imaginary to the signifiers that compose the unconscious subject. It is that binding between unconscious subject and ego that even makes possible the neurotic's reformulation of the question into a symptom. This function of the signifier that binds other signifiers to signifieds for the subject is called the quilting point. 12. The failure or refusal to acquire the signifier representing the big other does not mean that the big other goes away altogether, but instead reappears in the real in the form of an imaginary auditory hallucination, and that continues to remain a kind of commandment that ordinarily would be silently spoken at the level of the unconscious, but now is being made explicit. At the same time, the question that comes to meet this signifier is also hallucinated, giving rise to what is described as a discordant and incessant discourse. Now, with all that, we can begin to entertain some of the central themes in lectures 22 and 23. As you no doubt notice if you've taken a look at these lectures, they're mostly consisting of discussions around certain verb tenses of otherwise similar sentences. Most prominent among them is a sentence that is translated as, "Thou art the one who will follow me everywhere," and the other sentence is, "Thou art the one who wilt follow me everywhere." The important thing for our purposes here is that both sentences in French are pronounced exactly the same. The first one is, "Tu es celui qui me suivra partout." And the other one is, "Tu es celui qui me suivra partout." So they sound exactly the same. It's only in seeing them written out that you can actually tell the difference in the verb tense. In my other video, I'll explore these grammatical dimensions in greater depth. But for now, what's important is considering what determines how the addressee interprets the sentence, what meaning they give to it. Now, across all the examples Lacan uses, a consistent difference in meaning among the pairs of sentences is the degree of certainty and doubt the sentences communicate to the listener or to the addressee. However, what determines whether it is a sentence that is filled with certainty or doubt itself depends upon the interpretation of the listener, since those sentences are phonetically the same due to a quirk of the French language. So what determines how the listener interprets the statement depends on whether they identify with the subject of the sentence, thou, and that will depend on what kind of relationship they have with the speaker of the sentence. In psychosis, because that relationship is, in a certain sense, non-existent, because the one who speaks is, in fact, the big other, this will entail a depersonalization of the sentence's pronouns such that the thou, that is me, the listener, is not the same as the one who will follow. In this sentence, we can see there is a change from the second person to the third person. This depersonalization represents the alienation of the ego from itself as it comes to reappear in the innumerable little others that will populate the psychotic's world. So at this point, many of you may be asking, why is Lacan doing this? Why not just come out and say what he means rather than speak in this confusing fashion? And I get it. Trust me, I get it. But let me try to express his intent as far as I can understand it. Lacan believes that language holds the key because, as I've already said, the unconscious is structured like language. Furthermore, because language is not a private affair but a public social phenomenon, so too is the unconscious. And so we don't have to go positing invisible realities of the mind that remain intangible. Instead, we can find what we're looking for with regard to the truth of the unconscious in the materiality of the signifiers themselves. You could say that this is a materialist reading of the Freudian unconscious, much in the same way as Marx provides a materialist reading of the Hegelian dialectic. Instead of the materiality of modes, means, and relations of production as they function within economic structures, we have the materiality of signifiers as they function within symbolic structures. Indeed, some interesting works have been published discussing the connections between these two figures, Lacan and Marx. And so what Lacan is showing here in this example is what can also be identified in the world of Schreber. But we don't even have to look that far to some 19th century author with a psychotic structure to be able to get a little bit more of an understanding of this. If you have access to very young children that you can observe, you've got some nice little proto-psychotics right there. My 2.5-year-old son, for example, who has been, in fact, quite precocious with language, but has yet to master the use of pronouns. He's not acquired the ability to say I when the other says you. So just recently, I was having an exchange with him in which I said, put on your shoes. And as expected, he pointed to his shoes and said, your shoes, even though they were his shoes. He has not demonstrated yet the ability to consistently put himself in the you. And as such, there's a kind of porousness between self and other that makes for a tenuous reality at best. And so, once he masters this ability, it will entail a transformed relationship to reality. And you can see this with children, because once they internalize the you as an I, there also comes along some new psychological phenomenon. For example, you see the first evidence for the capacity to feel shame, suggesting, in this case, that there is some internalization of the paternal signifier. We can actually turn to the book of Genesis and find the same unfolding. I'm sure someone's written on this before, but if not, this would be a quite interesting essay to develop further. So, in turning to Genesis, we find God delivering a commandment. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Now, does Adam and Eve identify with the you in this commandment? Well, a little later, the serpent comes in and asks Eve, did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman replies to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but then she follows this up with saying, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. So although there's at least an initial identification in the permission given of you are free to eat, the same doesn't hold true for the prohibition. So there's not yet clear evidence that the signifier you has been completely internalized as an I or even as a we. Perhaps just like young children are on the path to mastering that ability, so are Adam and Eve. But pay attention now to what happens once they eat the fruit. That is, once they internalize the signifier of prohibition. So a little later, God comes by and calls out to Adam, "Where are you?" And for the first time, we hear from the human subject the unequivocal conversion of the you into the I, when Adam answers the Lord's question with, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid." I. This is the exact wording of the NIV translation. It'd be interesting to see if it holds up in other translations, but for our purposes, hopefully it illustrates the point. This ability to convert the yous into the I's is not just about some natural maturation of the mind, but is established or mediated through a relationship with the speaker who is in a position of authority over the listener. And if I don't internalize the rules of grammar, I can't master the use of these pronouns. And similarly, if I cannot internalize the fundamental signifier that represents the big other to me, it'll be quite difficult to bind signifiers with signifieds, which we see in the case of Schreber, who, according to Lacan, lacks the signifier of being a father. And for this reason, he is first bewildered when confronted with an utterance coming from elsewhere that states to him how nice it would be to be a woman undergoing intercourse, which ultimately leads Schreber down the unexpected path of believing himself needing to become transformed into a woman to bring about pregnancy. Now, you may be wondering, how in the world does one get from point A to point B here? It's such an odd conclusion to draw. So to help us with this, Lacan provides a very useful metaphor of a highway. It might be easier to imagine a time prior to GPS for this metaphor to work properly. Let's imagine this highway stretches from Boston to Miami. That's I-95. With this highway, we're not simply compelled to head to Miami, but are allowed to get off, make pit stops, do some sightseeing of towns along the way, and do all this without getting completely off track from our ultimate destination of Miami. Additionally, it's the case that due to the presence of the highway, many of the towns that I visit only exist because the highway was first there. The towns were built around the highway. Metaphorically, these towns represent centers of meaning for the subject. And the highway functions not just to get me from Boston to Miami, but structures the entire experience along the way as I travel there. The highway, as a metaphor for the fundamental signifier, channels and restricts experience, meanings, so as to flow in an orderly fashion. And this is why Lacan places such emphasis on signifiers over signifieds. It's because signifieds are in some sense highly dependent on signifiers, not only for being orderly, but in many cases to even exist at all. Now let us imagine another scenario in which there is no highway, but just a lot of minor routes or little roads that exist. Now, not only does it take me a lot longer to get to my destination, but I might not end up there at all without the highway and without GPS. And perhaps even if I do have a map of sorts, the choices that I make as to what paths I'll drive on gets determined through a mixture of happenstance and capriciousness. Perhaps I'll choose this road to go down since it looks more paved and a little safer. Or this seems to be heading in the right direction, but oh no, I made a wrong turn. So instead of the quilting point of the highway I-95 being our guiding light, I instead rely on signs that are found on the side of roads in these small roads, which are pointing me not to the final destination, not to Miami, but to other nearby locations that might get me closer to where I want to go, but maybe not. And this is sort of reflecting the kind of disorder of metonymy that was mentioned in a previous video. So these signs by the road are like the auditory hallucinations experienced in psychosis, these free-floating independent signifiers that are not organized in a systematic fashion by a fundamental signifier. They appear on the periphery of experience instead, just like the signs appear on the side of the road. And so without the fundamental signifier, we find ourselves heading down innumerable paths that often lead to surprising destinations, such as what we see in the case of Schreber. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. The next video I will upload is going to be part 2, and more in-depth analysis of lectures 22 and 23. There was a lot I skipped over that's worthy of discussion, such as what Lacan has to say about the superego, how the sentences he uses can be situated within schema L, and why exactly being a father is a signifier. So if you want to go into greater depth, I'll encourage you to watch that video when it's available. I might suggest, if you have Seminar 3 on hand, to at least look at those lectures to provide some corresponding experience with what will be discussed. Otherwise, I'll be with you all again as we cover the last 2 lectures of Seminar 3. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, you be well.